Hey guys, I wanted to just say a couple of brief things about the Sublime and Percy's poem, especially since this Engage activity was kind of our one time to deal with his poem. You guys did a great job with pulling passages together, and I really appreciate that. And be sure you look at the email that I am about to send out, and it includes a little bit of a summary of what some of you said. I did want to just point to a couple things in Percy's poem, and this is building off of things that you all already pointed out. And I just, I honestly haven't read Percy Shelley's Mont Blanc in conjunction with Last Man, because I normally teach Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And so I found myself noticing some different things in his poem, especially after reading what you all had to say as well. And I'm thinking particularly here about the destructive element in Percy's poem. I think before I was paying more attention to sort of the awe that he felt and the wisdom of the mountain, as well as the play between voices and sounds and then silence. There's also a good deal about kind of the unknown. That's how we end his poem. His poem reminds me of that saying, the end of his poem reminds me of that saying, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to hear it, does it make a sound? Or something like that. I think I'm butchering that. And he kind of has that same sort of question to end his poem about sort of the influence of nature on us and its power. And I think the key, though, is it kind of ends with this uncertainty and this unknown. And that the sort of vagueness of that is inspiring for Percy instead of terrifying. Gianna mentioned a little bit about kind of the unknown and the connection to the sublime. So those are all things that I've noticed before. But what really stood out to me is there is a lot of destruction in this poem as well. Clearly we see that in Mary Shelley's novel too. So if you look around line 105 in stanza 4, we have a city of death, distinct with many a tower and wall impregnable of beaming ice. Yet not a city, but a flood of ruin is there, that from the boundaries of the sky rolls its perpetual stream. Vast pines are strewing its destined path, or in the mangled soil. That's such a very powerful image, I think, mangled soil. Branchless and shattered stand. The rocks, drawn down from yon remotest waste, have overthrown the limits of the dead and living world, never to be reclaimed. The dwelling place of insects, beasts, and birds becomes its spoil, their food and their retreat forever gone. So much of life and joy is lost. The race of man flies far in dread. His work and dwelling vanish like smoke before the tempest stream, and their places not known. There's that unknown, right? And then we have vast caves, and so we kind of have this image of this flood just creating all this destruction, and I think that is interesting given the clear destruction that we have in Mary Shelley too, and some of you point to the different ways that destruction functions in these two poems, but that destruction could be a form of sublime is sort of interesting, and I just wanted to highlight, which some of you also pointed out, that the sublime can only be awe-inspiring when you're not going through it yourself. If you're going through it yourself, then it just becomes terrorizing, right? So if you're in the flood, right, it's not sublime anymore. But if you're standing up and observing it, it can be sublime, right? So I just want to note that difference. And then I also want to draw attention to make sure that we're separating beautiful nature from sublime nature. So it's not just enough to say that, oh, nature in both of these texts have an effect. Well, yes, that is true for a lot of writers, particularly romantic writers that we're looking at, right? Nature has an effect on people. But what we're interested in here is specifically the sublime in nature. So not calm, beautiful, smooth, pretty nature, right? But the sort of craggy, wild, almost terrifying, overwhelming kind of nature, right? And so the idea that this kind of imagery could be inspiring is coming out of the 18th century in Burke, who was cited on the handout that I provided for you. So that's the other kind of thing I wanted to just mention too, is that the sublime was supposed to have a moral influence. I like to think of it as it kind of puts people in their place, right? It sort of says, hey, look, the world doesn't revolve around you. you're pretty small when it comes to everything else. And so the Sublime just kind of humbles us and makes us rethink our role and our place in kind of the grand scheme of things, right? This is often why Sublime can be transcendent, right? It transports us out of our current mindset, which is quite small, right? And it gets us thinking about big, grand things. And so the last sort of little thing that I wanted to just add is that I think there are lots of ways that Mary Shelley is working within that typical tradition of Sublime, and it's why we can find so many correspondences between both Percy and Mary's use of the Sublime. But Mary is also challenging the Sublime as it is presented by those sort of typical male, especially poets of the Romantic age. And just two of the ways that she challenges that is by pointing to the problems of isolation. So Sublime is often represented as this moment where someone is by themselves observing something in nature that is sublime. And especially in Frankenstein, we see that isolation critiqued, right? But I think we also see that in Last Man, and I think perhaps that will become more apparent as Bernie is going to experience more sort of solitude, and so maybe paying attention to the end of the novel and how Sublime figures in there. The other way that she critiques it too is that Sublime, which is often connected to the imagination I mentioned, and that's the moral part of the Sublime, right? Because many romantics thought the imagination is what's going to save us, not rationality, right? The imagination. And while Mary Shelley, I think, wouldn't necessarily put herself in the rationality camp, she is a little more cautious about saying imagination is going to win the day. And I think she found some problems with the particular male romantic version of imagination. And so there's a little bit of a critique there that, because we'll see in The Last Man, that imagination fails humanity, right? That none of the leaders could imagine a way out of this pandemic. And so there is actually a lack of imagination. And so that's another way you can sort of see Shelley critiquing the Sublime, that it wasn't enough to save humanity. So thank you for thinking about that. I know Sublime is a hard concept. Percy's poem is hard, but hopefully thinking about it in relation to Last Man made it a little more accessible. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation on Friday on the discussion board, kind of relating Last Man to our current